we're going to be talking about transportation, a super important topic in Austin, something we all love to talk about, complain about, etc. My name is Amy Stansberry. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Austin Common, and we're partnering with MoveATX, who's also on the call today, to share some information about Austin's transit system and give people some context. That's what I really want to talk about on today's call. You know, I think so many people, a big reason we have a transportation problem, or part of it, is that we're a fast growing city. And that means we have a lot of people moving here who maybe don't know the history of how we got to where we are today, or really understand like what's being done to improve our transportation problem. So maybe Jim, if we could start with you, just introduce yourself, and then maybe like set the scene of where we are in transit. Like when you talk to people about why improving our transportation issues are so important, like what do you tell them beyond just traffic? We know traffic's a problem.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I'm Jim Wick. I'm the lead organizer for MoveATX. We're an advocacy organization here in Austin that works to promote infrastructure that is not automobile-based or dependent. And really, we are at a pivotal moment in Austin's history right now, leading up to the November election, where we can make a choice as a city which direction we're going to go. For several decades now, we've been planning and we've been doing a great job planning to move our city away from automobile dependency, which is an affliction that most Texas cities suffer. Austin perhaps acutely because of geography and choices we've made to preserve lands, rightfully so, and protect our environment from massive highway construction. But we've done that without making the investments in infrastructure, critical infrastructure like transit, a large-scale transit system, bikeways, sidewalks, urban trails. And we've begun to make those investments in the last decade, and we're making tremendous progress. But now we have an opportunity to really step it up and create a system that moves us towards our goal, which is to get people out of their cars and move to a 50-50 mode share by 2039 in our city. At the same time, we have other goals. We have environmental goals. We have safety goals. We're trying to reduce fatalities, and we're trying to reduce emissions. And so we have a big chance and opportunity right now in our city.
Yeah, and so you said, one thing I want to stop you on before we go further is you mentioned 50-50 mode share. And so this is like a term that people might have heard thrown around lately. What does that mean when you say 50-50 mode share? What's a mode share?
So mode share is what people use to take a trip. So if you add up all the trips in the city, not just commuting trips, but trips to the grocery store and trips to the pet store and trips to Costco, trips to pick up food, trips to go shopping, all those trips make up what we would call the total trips in the city. And our goal is to get 50% of those to be taken by something other than a single occupancy vehicle or a car.
And what are we at right now? Like, what's our current mode share?
I believe right now we're at 74% automobile mode share. That's single occupancy vehicle. A lot of that is single occupancy vehicle commuters. A lot of people, use a car to go to the convenience store half a mile down the road or a mile away. Or to pick up their kids from school, or to pick up groceries, or to pick up something at the pharmacy. Those short trips in particular are places where we can really make up some ground, but at the same time we need a functioning system that allows people to commute in something other than a single occupancy vehicle.
Right. And so when you talk about that, I think a lot of times when people think about improving transportation system, they think only of public transit, and obviously public transit's a key component. But what you're talking about, it doesn't have to be like, we don't need everyone to be riding a bus, right? It's like more about creating a bunch of different options people can take instead of driving alone in their car.
That's right. It's about options, and we're certainly not trying to force every person to do something other than drive a car. In fact, we're conceding that half of the trips will still be taken by single occupancy vehicle. And so it's about giving people options and helping them feel safe and comfortable getting to a transit stop or getting to the convenience store in a way that doesn't involve them, getting in their car and driving it there. And that's a lot to do with how we build our streets and roads, and how we build our city. And that's what the choices are in front of us in November, in terms of what does the next 20 years look like in our city, and how do we build it? Do we build it for cars, or do we build it for people?
I think that's a good time to maybe bring in Adam Greenfield. And so, Adam, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, you were talking about all these different ways of people maybe being able to get around. And you've spent a lot of time advocating for ways for people to, like, sidewalk improvements and other kind of active transportation options. Can you want to chime in and maybe introduce yourself, and then talk a little bit about your work advocating for those types of transportation modes?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Greenfield. I'm the campaign manager for Prop B. And I'm also on the boards of Walk Austin and Bike Austin. So this is very much my world. I'm also outgoing chair of the City of Austin Pedestrian Advisory Council, which advises government bodies on pedestrian infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, we have an acute need for this infrastructure. There's recent polling data shows that over half of Austinites want to get around in a way other than driving a car. And yet 76% of people are still driving alone. So, there's a pent up need for this. And we've seen this year that levels of walking and biking have shot up since people are been staying at home more. And some of those patterns are going to continue for the long term, we expect. In fact, recent polling shows over 40% of people say that they're walking and biking more because of the pandemic. So there's just, not only this year, but in preceding years and in the years to come, there's just been a sea change in how people want to get around, and to an extent how people are getting around. And Prop B and Prop A together, and it's very important that they're both passed, are going to facilitate what people want to do.
Yeah, and so when you talk about bike lanes and sidewalks in Austin, for people who aren't as familiar, like, what are our big picture goals as a city for bike lanes and sidewalks? Because we have kind of a strategy in place, or some big picture goals, right?
Yeah, we have a sidewalk plan that aims to build out our sidewalk network, and that has a variety of levels of priority, very high, high. Prop B would provide funding for about 100 miles of sidewalks in the high and very high categories. On the bike side, we have a target of building out the all ages and abilities network of bike lanes, which are bike lanes that an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old would feel comfortable in, building out 80% of our proposed network by 2025. And having built out 50% of that by the end of this year. I think we're going to be around 47, 48%. So we're around the target for that. So they're ambitious, but with, we have the staff are ready for this. It's a popular issue among the public, and elected officials are on board too. So one of the reasons why we pushed really hard to get Prop B on the ballot in November is because all the stars are aligned to pass this.
And so you keep mentioning Prop B. I just want to take a moment in case people are not familiar, have never heard of it. You said you're advocating for Prop B, but just give people like the general definition. You're like, what is Prop B? What are they going to be voting on in November?
Okay, yes. So Prop B is a proposed $460 million bond that would fund pedestrian, bicycle, and safe streets infrastructure. So if you go to our website, safemobilityforall.org, or just do a search for Prop B Austin, you'll see the breakouts, but that would be sidewalks, bike network, and urban trails network, building out those networks, Vision Zero improvements, some large capital improvements like phase 1 of Congress Avenue improvements, a new pedestrian bridge next to the Longhorn Dam, safe routes to school funding, some substandard improvements, transit enhancements, and a few other things in there. So this would be the biggest amount of funding for these improvements in Austin's history. We definitely have a great precedent.
You're cutting a little in and out there, but I think I got what you were saying at the very end. This is, like you mentioned, one of our biggest investments we've really ever made in this kind of transportation. It would be if it passed. And then just for people, can you explain, if people don't know what a bond is, what does that mean?
A bond is basically something that the city issues. It's a way to fund large capital projects that have kind of an initial expense, but then there isn't too much maintenance after that. So the city issues bonds, the bonds are bought, that gives the city a large amount of cash to spend basically at once. And then the city pays those off over time.
With the property, usually with a property tax increase, right? So it's like the question that people are going to have to ask, and kind of what I'm wondering from you too is, you know, it does cost people a bit more on their property tax bill if this were to pass. And so I can't remember what the exact dollar amount is, maybe $60 a year when the bond comes to full fruition. But what for you, and when you're advocating for it or when you're talking to people, why do you say it's worth the money? You know, because it is an investment. Like, why do you feel like it's important that we do this and it would pay off for us in the long run?
Yeah, well, certainly on the Prop B side, this is a really, when all is said and done, this is a steal as an investment. This is a fantastic investment for Austin. So basically the Prop B bonds would be sold between about 2022 and 2028, the years. And then at the peak, that would cost the owner of a median value home about $6 to $7 a month, or $67 a year. That would be at the peak. So in most of the years, the cost would be lower than that. But then what we get is just going to be incredible. Just as context, every dollar that we spend on walking and biking infrastructure saves society about $3 in health costs. At the same time, every taxpayer in Austin every year spends about $3,300 a year paying for traffic crashes, all of the costs that related to traffic crashes. So that's $3,300 versus $76 a year for Prop B. And that would create a walking, biking, and safe streets network that would give people, to Jim's point, more choices to get around. You know, walking is free. Bicycling annually costs usually around $100 to $300. So that would give more people the choice to get around in very inexpensive ways.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a moment to bring on another guest. We have Jay Crossley with us. Jay, I know you've done a whole bunch of different advocacy and are interested in transit in all different ways. But I'm wondering if maybe you could explain one of the terms that Adam brought up, which is Vision Zero. Can you maybe introduce yourself real quick and then mention what is Vision Zero? What are we talking about?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, and hi everybody. Jay Blazer Crossley with a nonprofit called Farm and City, and we work across the state and across different policy issues, but all related to transportation, urban planning, sustainability, and equity. And Vision Zero Texas is one of our biggest projects, which is the statewide movement towards Vision Zero, which is there's an international movement to end traffic deaths and to say that the only acceptable number of people to die getting around our city is 0. And we don't accept that people are being killed going to the store or coming home from work. in a car or while walking. And so the city of Austin adopted Vision Zero about 5 years ago, and is working to change city policies and so that we're not hurt. And we have a long way to go, but governments in Texas, from TxDOT and the state level to the city of Austin, and now a growing number of cities across the state are working on this and changing the way we design our streets. And so it's very exciting that both Prop B includes a substantial investment in safety, and that will be safety for all modes, and that will be fixing a lot of our worst intersections. And so if you're driving a car in Austin, that bond will help you get home safely. But also installing pedestrian hybrid beacons and other safety treatments for pedestrians. But also the sort of Texas's historic lack of investment in transit is a safety problem. And riding on the bus is the safest way to get anywhere. And so also investing in transit will help give people safe options for getting around. And so I think we have a lot more to do, but there's some amazing work that's been happening at the city of Austin and now really growing across the state.
Yeah, the Vision Zero work is so interesting to me because shockingly, I feel like safety is not part of the conversation so often when we talk about our transportation system. And when you look at the number of deaths, I mean, that die each year in the US from car accidents, car crashes, it's crazy. And you know, you talk to anyone and they have a story of a family member or loved one that was killed or injured in a car crash. And you just don't, like, Vision Zero's approach is interesting because, like, saying, like, we shouldn't have that. And I think we've grown, like, accustomed to feeling like this is the way it is.
Right, but it's not okay. And Texas, right. Texas leads the nation in traffic deaths, and 10 people die every day in Texas, and another 50 people suffer horrible life-changing injuries in our transportation system. We have a terribly failed transportation system. That doesn't have to be that way. It's not as bad in most other major U.S. cities, and in other parts of the world, it's much better, much safer. And here in Austin, Austinites drive more than Texans and other major metros because we actually have more roads per capita and more car dependency, and so we actually are dying more per capita than other major Texas metros. And so for too long, we've just accepted that. And we work with a group called Central Texas Families for Safe Streets. And part of what they do is that people really suffer. And that's 10 families a day lose a loved one that suddenly, unexpectedly. And so we Texans at least need to understand that that's happening and that that's not okay. And so we're changing the dialogue, and Texans are understanding that, and we're getting better at it, and we're trying to fix it.
And like you said, that means that correlates to safety improvements on the streets. You mentioned the pedestrian hybrid beacons, which people might know are those things where you press the button and you get to cross the street with a real light. I assume also kind of wrapped up in this is also this idea of genuinely protected bike lanes, not just, kind of a painted line, but some kind of physical barrier there. Medians, I think I've heard, and anything else that kind of like how you see this play out in real life.
Well, so I think one of the exciting things that's included in the bond is specifically money for the city's speed management program. And for decades, Texas engineers have made the mistake to design all our streets assuming that people are going to drive too fast and be drunk, and then we try to design the street to handle that. And what that does is if you drive down North Lamar today, it's very uncomfortable to drive at the speed limit. You feel strange if you drive safely in Austin because the street is too wide and there's nothing in your way and it feels like a racetrack. And so the city of Austin has changed its policy, and TxDOT, and it's not just the city of Austin changing engineering standards. And we are redesigning our streets and retrofitting to make the normal, the intuitive, comfortable way to drive the safe way. And so some of the funds in Prop B will go towards changing street layout just to make it comfortable to be safe. And that's things like medians. It's things like changing the way the street works. And it's also adding trees. And if there's people and trees and nice things to look at, everyone drives safer. So I'm very excited about those elements of what Austin is doing.
Great. And I want to make sure we bring in our last guest here. We've got Luke Metzger from Environment Texas. You know, when we're talking about transportation, like we've mentioned, we talked about safety and obviously just like ease of life. And transportation, I mean, the environment is another big component of that. Can you give us a little bit of context about, you know, I think maybe on its face, people might wonder, why is an environmental organization so passionate about improving our transit system in Austin? Can you talk about the effect that our transportation system, as it has been, is starting to have on our local environment?
Yeah, sure, Amy. So I'm with Environment Texas. We're a nonprofit advocacy group working for clean air, clean water, and open spaces. And today is actually an Ozone Action Day. So the Texas Commission on Environmental Equality has issued an alert for the Austin area saying that the air is polluted, and that's puts certain people in Austin at risk of health problems. And unfortunately, that is not an isolated instance. That too often that happens. We released a report last year that found in 2018, Austin experienced more than 4 months of elevated smog and fine particulate pollution above kind of monitoring levels. And that really does put people at risk, whether it's children with asthma or contributing to cardiovascular disease, even death. Air pollution, is a killer. It kills thousands of people around the country every year. And unfortunately, Austin, in large part because of our pollution coming from cars and trucks, it continues to suffer from air pollution, unsafe levels of bad air. And that's just one of the consequences from our fossil fuel car-based transportation structure. If we look at climate change, we're also experiencing some very significant impacts from a warming climate. For example, I moved here in 2000, and according to the records, before I moved here, Texas used to have just about a dozen days a year that were triple digit. And since I've moved here, that's gone up 3 times, more than a month worth of triple digit days on average every year. That just make life and quality of life just so much less than it should be. So people expect Texas to be hot, but it's not supposed to be this hot. It used to be a lot cooler during the summer, not this bad. And the predictions are that if we don't, dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, including from transportation, that those numbers are going to double again, go up to 60 days or even 90 days, by the end of the century of triple digit heat. And that's just miserable, and nobody should have to live like that. And so, and then if you look at flooding, Central Texas has had, several 100-year floods in just a short span of years. That's cost dozens of lives and millions of dollars in property damage. So we know that the costs to public health and to property from the environmental damage associated with our current transportation system are very high. And as Adam and the others have pointed out, these investments in alternative transportation models more than pay for themselves in terms of their benefits and to our health and to our environment.
Yeah, and I know for folks that might be following the climate equity plan, city's climate equity plan was released recently, and in it, it showed that transportation is quickly becoming our biggest source as a city of emissions, and without some major interventions, it'll almost cancel out all of the great work we're doing reducing emissions from energy usage, which we have been able to do as a community for years. But the transportation side has always been a big question mark, I think, for the environmental community locally.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've made great progress in cleaning up our electric grid. More than half of our electricity in Austin comes from wind and solar power. We're set to get to 65%, in the next couple of years. And then the next step will be getting to 100%. We're, also making, progress in weatherizing homes and making more, buildings and appliances more energy efficient, but we haven't made the same strides on the transportation sector, which is the largest source of emissions in Austin. More than 40% of the pollution coming from cars and trucks, and that's very concerning, and to the public generally, but especially to people who live next to highways. So my two daughters, I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, who go to a daycare right next to I-35, and the studies actually show that air pollution can diminish their learning capacity. They did a study in Los Angeles that found that simply installing air filters in schools next to highways led to a better educational outcome than reducing class sizes. So we know that, air pollution, again, making people sick, killing some people, even, limiting the potential of our children. And that's really scary. And so, that's why it's just so critical that we build a new transportation system that provides different ways for people to get around, that they can walk and bike to school or to work, that they can, take a bus or a train for longer distances. And if they do need a car, it's fully electric, car powered by 100% renewable energy. That's the transportation system we need to be shifting towards.
Yeah. And Jim, I want to bring you back in. I think that what we're talking about here is really reimagining what our transportation system could look like, especially for a city like Austin that is in Texas and was definitely built for cars originally, or, in recent memory. And how can we be sure, it does cost money. And like a lot of folks have said, it seems like the benefits could outweigh it, but how do we make sure we're building a system that is improving the lives of Austinites, that the money is worth it, that it's an equitable system? At MoveATX, how do you kind of balance those concerns, or how do you look at it to say, how can we really make this improve the lives of Austinites, especially those who need it or might rely on alternative transportation modes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think helping people understand the aggregate costs of transportation and owning, maintaining, fueling, driving a car is actually very expensive. If you're in a 2-car household, your annual transportation costs for owning and maintaining and operating that vehicle can be up to $10,000. And when we talk about annually $10,000, when we talk about the affordability crisis in Austin and displacement and people being unable to afford to live in our city because of escalating cost of living and property values, because so many people want to live here, demand is very high. We have to look at what Austinites are spending their money on. And the price of admission for Austin shouldn't be owning a car. That's not the kind of city that we want to have. It's pretty clear that the values of our city are that we want people to be able to afford to live here and not have to own a car. And so the transportation system and the transit system needs to enable that. And while the upfront cost may seem prohibitive, in the long term, for most Austinites, it will pay off. If you're close to a transit line, or you're able to walk to a bus stop or walk to a train stop in the future of Austin, hopefully when these bonds pass, you'll be able to save a lot more money, even going from a 2-car household to a 1-car household. I think a lot of Austinites aspire to that, only using their car when they absolutely have to. And the problem is that people don't feel safe. And if you don't feel safe, there's an illusion of safety surrounding cars. And so people will use a car to make a trip because they feel like riding a bike or walking is not safe or opens them up to some kind of danger. And so that's all tied into the affordability equation. And, I think one of the most amazing things about Prop A, the transit prop, is that it includes $300 million in affordable housing for low-income Austinites and money to help folks stay in their homes around the stations and along the lines in a way that, you know, it's really a first of its kind of idea to make this kind of investment as we build out our system to make sure that when we build new stations and that we're building affordable housing for people who are making, you know, less than half of the median income in our community. That's a really important way to ensure that all of Austin can participate in our economy, have access to opportunity. That's the big thing. And again, you know, if you have to own and maintain a car to participate in Austin's economy, that's a high bar for a lot of people. The costs are very prohibitive, and we can be a better city if we lower the barriers to entry into Austin's opportunity, which there's a lot of opportunity in our city.
Great. Before we close, I want to make sure we have an opportunity to let people know who are listening or watching how they can get engaged with our city's transportation system. If this is something you're passionate about, how can you start to make progress and be engaged? Obviously, we've talked about some things that are on the election, but also, Jim, you know, I know you guys are primarily like an educational organization and do work all the time. Like, what advice would you have for people who are passionate about this? How can they get involved?
Well, I think the organizations represented on this call are all excellent ways to get involved in the various avenues of advocacy. MoveATX, Environment Texas, Farm and City, Bike Austin, Walk Austin. All 5 of these organizations are engaged in the day-to-day goings-on and advocacy at the city and state level. You know, Environment Texas and Farm and City are focused on making change, you know, all over the state. And so there's opportunities there to get involved. And of course, you know, paying attention to what's happening at City Council, making sure that our council and our city staff make the right choices. So when the city has a public meeting to ask for input or puts a survey out to say, hey, you know, what do you think? You know, sign up for the city's listservs at austintexas.gov and the transportation department and the watershed department, and you know, go to meetings when we can do that again. You can go to Zoom meetings for the Pedestrian Advisory Council, Bicycle Advisory Council, you know, Zero Waste Advisory Council. There's a lot of ways to get involved, but I would say probably the easiest way is to go to the websites of the organizations on this call and sign up for emails, and trust me, we'll let you know when there are opportunities to you know, work for and build a city that we all want to see.
Yeah, I'll give kind of everyone an opportunity to share their websites and things like that. Adam, maybe we'll start with you. You mentioned that you've served on several city advisory councils, and this is another great way to get involved, and I don't think a lot of folks know about it. Can you give a brief explanation of what those, did you say you were on the Pedestrian Advisory Council, Adam? What that is real quick, and how people can follow along with the work of these advisory councils?
Yeah, so on the mobility front, there's two advisory councils. One is the Pedestrian Advisory Council, which I'm outgoing chair of, and there's the Bicycle Advisory Council. And they, as I said earlier, they both advise government entities, usually the city of Austin, but sometimes the state of Texas or the metropolitan area on their respective issues. And if you just do a search online for Austin Pedestrian Advisory Council, Bicycle Advisory Council, you can find the web pages. They meet monthly. They have been meeting via video conference recently, and that's something that the public can attend. And those are really
volunteer for, right? You could also serve on one of those advisory.
You can serve on them. Unfortunately, the application period for the next round of elections for those councils just closed. But they do happen annually in September. So you can wait it out another year. But I recommend, I mean, it is a good way to just get a finger on the pulse of what's happening, is just to sit in on those meetings. They're somewhat informal. They usually feature presentations and question and answers. And they're just a good way to kind of get a sense of what's going on out there. So I recommend them. And the people who serve on them are passionate, and they're also citizens, that they're not always trained in these subjects, but they enjoy the subjects, they read up on them, they do their homework, and that's something that a lot of people can do. And if people watching this don't have a long storied experience in pedestrian and bicycle advocacy or issues, there is still a huge role for you. There's so much that needs to be done to just learn more and advocate more and get better city funding and policies for all these things. So it really is for everyone who's interested.
Great, thank you. And what about you, Jay? How can people get more involved with Farm and City?
Well, so just check it out at farmandcity.org. And we have monthly meetups that are now virtual, and we have an email newsletter, and we are ramping up efforts to support transit and safety at the legislature next year. So there's some exciting things to get behind there. I did want to just point out, since you mentioned the climate equity plan, I believe today is the deadline to comment on that plan. And so everybody, if you haven't already, go check out the plan and comment on it. And it could still be improved. And I think for today's discussion, the Project Connect process was an amazing process that I got the privilege of being very engaged in, and working with thousands of people, and thousands of Austinites have built a truly equitable transit plan that will serve sort of the most people possible with the money that we're proposing to be spent. And so it's crucial to engage in these plans and make them better. And so I hope you all will get engaged in that climate equity plan.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it's one of those things that a lot of folks, it goes under the radar. It can seem a little dry, all these plans that the city works on, but they do usually involve an extensive community engagement process, and they are a really good way to shape public policy in the city. So that's a good tip. And what about you, Luke? What's Environment Texas working on right now? What's the best way for people to support your work or get involved?
Yeah, well, our website's EnvironmentTexas, all spelled out, .org. We're also on all the social medias. If I could plug one transportation-related event we have coming up on October 10th, we're co-hosting a webinar about electric school buses and talking about some of the threats and risks to children's health from breathing diesel exhaust, as many of them do, unfortunately. And some of the advances in technology for electric school buses, financing opportunities, all focused specifically at Austin ISD and how we might move Austin ISD to be able to purchase some of these electric buses to protect children's health and the climate. So that's October 10th at 1 p.m. It's a Saturday. There's details on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/EnvironmentTexas.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to talk some about transportation in Austin. Obviously, a lot's going on, a lot of ways to get engaged. I hope that everyone listening learned a little something and maybe got some ideas for different groups to get involved with. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amy.